I wasn't just being watched. They were documenting everything, waiting for me to make one mistake they could use. She didn't even look embarrassed when I confronted her. 3 weeks ago, Lisa said, "Dad, maybe you should consider assisted living. You've been so forgetful lately. We're just worried about your safety." And I believed her. And then I found the camera hidden behind my picture frames. And the worst part? She'd been recording me for months. I trusted my daughter more than anyone in the world. She said she was worried about me, about my memory, about my safety. I thought she was protecting me. I didn't realize she was building a case against me. I found the first camera on a Tuesday morning while dusting the living room. A tiny black device, no bigger than a quarter, tucked behind the family photo on my mantelpiece. The one of Lisa's graduation from nursing school, her smile bright with promise and pride. I stared at it for a full minute, trying to understand what I was seeing. A camera. In my house. Hidden behind my daughter's photograph. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs as I turned the small device over in my hands. Professional grade, wireless, the kind that streams video directly to someone's phone or computer. I learned I was being surveilled in my own home from a piece of technology I didn't even know existed. 3 weeks of Lisa visiting more frequently than she had in months. 3 weeks of her asking pointed questions about my daily routine, my medications, my ability to handle simple tasks. "Dad, did you remember to turn off the stove this morning? Are you sure you paid the electric bill? It seems like something you might forget. Maybe we should write things down for you, just to help you keep track." 2 years since my wife Margaret died. 2 years of learning to live alone in the house we'd shared for 38 years, and I'd been managing just fine. Better than fine, actually. I'd developed routines. I kept the house clean. I paid my bills on time. I took my medications as prescribed. I could feel people watching, not helping, just watching. But apparently, someone had been watching more carefully than I realized. Someone with access to my home, my daily life, my private moments. I sat in my recliner, staring at the camera in my palm, trying to process what this meant. My daughter, the woman I'd raised to be compassionate and honest. The nurse who'd chosen a career dedicated to caring for vulnerable people. She'd been spying on me. But why? The question burned in my chest as I remembered recent conversations differently. The way she'd push certain topics. The way she'd ask leading questions about my memory, my decision-making, my independence. Some of you know exactly what this feels like. That moment when you realize the person you trust most has been building a case against you. When concern becomes surveillance. When love becomes manipulation. I'd spent 40 years in law enforcement. Before I retired, I knew what evidence gathering looked like. I'd seen how people documented things when they wanted to prove someone was unfit, incompetent, dangerous. Lisa was building a file on me, her own father. I set the camera on the coffee table and stared at it. Such a small thing. Such a violation. 3 weeks of performance. 3 weeks of being watched, judged, recorded without my knowledge or consent. I lived in a suburban house on Elm Street, 3 bedrooms, paid off 15 years ago. The kind of place where neighbors knew each other's names and kids played in the front yards. A place where you didn't expect to find surveillance equipment hidden in your family photos. Margaret and I had raised Lisa in this house. She'd taken her first steps in this living room. She'd had birthday parties in this backyard. This was her childhood home, the place she'd always said felt like safety and love. And now, she was treating it like evidence. The morning was quiet around me. Coffee, growing cold on the side table. Morning news playing softly on the television. Normal sounds of a normal day that had just become anything but normal. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Something that recognized betrayal for what it was. If there was one camera, there were probably others. I stood up, camera still in my hand, and began to search. The house felt different as I moved through it. Like a stage set. Like a place where someone had been directing a performance I hadn't known I was giving. I found the second camera in the kitchen, attached to the underside of a cabinet with a clear view of the stove, the medication organizer on the counter. The third was in my bedroom, hidden in the fake plant Lisa had given me for Father's Day. To brighten up the room, Dad. Plants are supposed to be good for mental health. Mental health. Now that phrase took on a different meaning. I didn't react. I remembered everything. 3 weeks of Lisa's increased attention, phone calls that lasted longer than usual, visits that felt more like inspections than family time. How are you sleeping, Dad? Have you been taking your blood pressure medication? Every question now seemed loaded. Every observation felt like data collection. Lisa had made her choice. She decided I needed supervision. She decided to gather evidence instead of having an honest conversation. But something about those hidden cameras nagged at me. This wasn't casual concern. This was systematic documentation, the kind you do when you're preparing for something legal. I pulled out my laptop and researched. Assisted living facilities in our area, elder care law, guardianship proceedings, adult protective services. I found it within an hour. The pattern Lisa was following. The checklist for proving someone was no longer capable of living independently. Document unsafe behaviors, record memory lapses, evidence of poor judgment. This was a campaign, and I was the target. This wasn't about my safety. This was about control. 2 days later, Lisa called during her lunch break at the hospital. Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation the other day, about your living situation. I was in my garden, working with soil that didn't judge me. There's this wonderful place I'd like you to see, Sunset Manor. It's independent living with support. Services. At the time, it felt harmless. A daughter caring about her aging father's future, planning ahead, being responsible. I'm not interested in moving, Lisa. Would you at least look at it? Just for me? So I can stop worrying about you being alone in that big house? After we hung up, I called Sunset Manor myself. They knew who I was. Lisa had already inquired about availability, toured the facility, discussed care levels. Your daughter mentioned you've been having some cognitive challenges, the admissions coordinator said pleasantly. Cognitive challenges. I'd never been diagnosed with any cognitive challenges, but apparently Lisa had told them I had. After I hung up, I looked around my house with new eyes. Every room where I'd found cameras, every angle they covered, every behavior they could document. Lisa wasn't just watching me. She was building a case for moving me out of my own home. She said I'd been forgetful, unsafe, unable to manage on my own. She'd told complete strangers that I had cognitive challenges, without ever discussing any of this with me, without involving my doctor. If you know, you know. The feeling when you realize your own child sees you as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. The cameras were her insurance policy. Video evidence to back up her claims if anyone questioned her decision to move me to assisted living. They didn't realize they were dealing with someone who'd spent 4 decades investigating deception, and they didn't know I'd found their cameras. The signature on my bank account had never changed. My name, my house, my decisions. The next morning, I did what any good investigator would do. I gathered intelligence. I called my doctor's office and asked for my medical records. Clean bill of health. No cognitive concerns noted. I called my bank and requested account statements. All bills paid on time. No signs of financial mismanagement. I called neighbors who'd known me for 20 years. How do you think I've been doing since Margaret died? Unanimous response. You're doing great, Jim. Better than most people half your age. But something one neighbor said caught my attention. That daughter of yours has been asking questions, though. Wanted to know if we'd noticed any changes in your behavior. Said she was concerned about you living alone. When was this? Oh, a couple months ago. A couple of months ago, before the cameras. Lisa had been planning this longer than I'd realized. Most surveillance victims never know they're being watched, but I had 40 years of experience spotting lies, building cases, understanding motive and opportunity. I researched the legal requirements for involuntary commitment to assisted living. For guardianship proceedings, you needed evidence, documented patterns of unsafe behavior, medical backing, preferably video testimony showing clear incidents of poor judgment. Lisa was a nurse. She understood the system. She knew exactly what kind of evidence would be required to override my right to make my own decisions. She'd been methodically building that evidence for months. I reviewed the camera footage from my own system. I had installed security cameras around the outside of my house 3 years ago. Standard home security, motion-activated recording. The cameras showed everything. Lisa arriving when I wasn't home. Lisa inside my house for extended periods. Lisa placing small devices in strategic locations. That single detail changed everything. My daughter hadn't just been concerned about my welfare. She'd been systematically violating my privacy and planning to use that violation against me. But there was no real evidence of decline, because there wasn't any decline to document. I was functioning perfectly well, independent, competent, capable. Lisa needed evidence that didn't exist, so she was creating conditions to generate the evidence she needed. The increased visits weren't just surveillance, they were disruption, breaking my routines, creating stress and confusion. The pointed questions weren't concern. They were psychological manipulation, designed to make me second-guess my own capabilities. But there was no crisis, only a daughter who decided her father couldn't be trusted to live independently, regardless of the evidence. I didn't confront her immediately. I planned. Quiet people prepare louder than they speak. I documented everything, photographed the cameras, downloaded my security footage, printed my medical records and bank statements. I researched elder abuse law, illegal surveillance, invasion of privacy. I called a lawyer, Margaret's sister's son, David, who specialized in elder law and family conflicts. "Uncle Jim, what you're describing is textbook elder abuse," David said. "The surveillance, the campaign to undermine your confidence, the attempts to override your autonomy. Over 2 weeks, I built a comprehensive file, evidence of Lisa's deception, proof of my competence, documentation of her systematic violation of my privacy. I arranged for independent medical and psychological evaluations, both confirmed what I already knew. I was cognitively intact, physically capable, and fully competent to live independently. I also researched Lisa's finances. Nurse salaries are good, but not great. Lisa had student loans, a mortgage on a house bigger than she needed, credit card debt, money was tight, and assisted living facilities weren't cheap. But if I sold my house to pay for care I didn't need, there would be money left over, money that would eventually become inheritance. I arranged my schedule carefully. 1 week before Lisa's next scheduled visit, I called David. "I'm ready," I said. "Set up the meeting." The following Tuesday, Lisa arrived with a folder full of brochures from assisted living facilities. She looked nervous, more nervous than I'd seen her in weeks. "Dad, I really think we need to talk seriously about your living situation." She spread glossy brochures across my coffee table. Sunset Manor, Golden Years Community, Peaceful Meadows Senior Living, all expensive, all requiring the liquidation of assets to afford long-term residence. "I've already talked to a few of these places," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Some of them have waiting lists, so if you're interested, we should move quickly." I felt something twist in my chest, something that recognized manipulation for what it was. I watched my daughter, the woman I'd raised to value honesty and integrity, lie to my face while secretly recording our conversation. She had no idea I'd found her surveillance equipment, no idea I'd spent 2 weeks building my own case. "Lisa," I said quietly, "before we talk about assisted living, I think there are some other things we need to discuss." "Like what?" I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, picked up the family photo. "Like this," I said, showing her the camera I'd found behind the frame. Her face went white. "Dad, I can explain." "Can you?" I set the camera on the coffee table next to her brochures. "Because I'm very interested in hearing your explanation for illegally surveilling me in my own home." Lisa's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I walked to the kitchen and returned with the second camera, then to my bedroom for the third. 3 devices, 3 months of violation, 3 rooms where my privacy had been systematically invaded by my own daughter. "These are professional surveillance devices, Lisa. Were you planning to tell me about them?" "Dad, please. I also have security footage of you entering my house and placing these devices while I wasn't home. I have printouts of conversations with Sunset Manor where you told them I had cognitive challenges. And I have documentation showing that you've been questioning my neighbors about my mental state for months." Lisa sat down heavily on the sofa. Her hands were shaking. "You forgot who raised you." She looked up at me, with eyes full of something that might have been shame. "You forgot what I used to do for a living. 40 years of police work, 40 years of understanding how people lie, how they manipulate, how they build cases against their victims. You were building a case. There's a difference between concern and evidence gathering." I sat down across from her, 3 cameras between us like evidence in a trial. "Here's what's going to happen, Lisa. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, you're going to meet with me and my lawyer. You're going to explain exactly what you've been planning. You're going to return any video footage you've collected, and you're going to sign a document agreeing that this surveillance ends immediately. Your lawyer? David Morrison, elder law specialist. He's very interested in discussing illegal surveillance and attempted financial exploitation with you." "I'm sorry," Lisa said quietly. "You're right, about all of it. Tell me why. Help me understand how my daughter." became someone who would do this. Lisa looked down at her hands. Money. It was always about money. I waited. The divorce was expensive. I took out loans, got behind on the mortgage. I was drowning. So you decided to drown me too. I panicked. I started thinking about your house, about how much it's worth, about how the money could solve all my problems and make sure you were safe at the same time. The truth, finally. But you were safe, Dad. You're independent and capable, and I knew that. I just convinced myself you'd be happier somewhere with activities and meal service. And somewhere that required liquidating my assets to afford. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. The cameras were to create evidence that didn't exist. Yes, I thought if I could document some incidents of forgetfulness or confusion, it would support the idea that you needed supervised care. But there weren't any incidents to document, because you're fine. The admission hung in the air between us. I wanted to stop, so many times, but I was in so deep, I didn't know how to get out without destroying our relationship completely. You destroyed it anyway, Lisa. Trust isn't something you can spy away and then expect to rebuild. She sobbed then, like a child who'd been caught in a lie so big it changed everything. I know I've lost your trust. I just want you to know that I do love you. I just lost sight of what that meant. I watched my daughter cry and felt something complicated in my chest. Love and disappointment and anger and sadness all mixed together. Love means respecting people's right to make their own decisions, Lisa, even when you disagree with those decisions. Do you? Or are you just sorry you got caught? Both, she said finally. I'm sorry I got caught, and I'm sorry I ever started this because it was wrong. That felt like the truth. 6 weeks later, Lisa and I met for coffee. She'd returned all the video footage. She'd signed the legal documents. She'd corrected her false statements about my cognitive abilities. She looked older somehow. How are you doing, Dad? I'm fine. Same as I've been all along. I know. I've always known that. We talked for an hour. About money, about pride, about the difference between helping someone and taking advantage of them. It wasn't complete healing. Trust broken over months doesn't rebuild in a single conversation. But it was a beginning. 6 months later, Lisa got her finances under control, sold her house for something smaller, found a second job, started paying down her debts the honest way. I needed to prove to myself that I could solve my problems without hurting people, she told me. She visits now, but differently. As a daughter, not as a caretaker. She asks about my well-being without questioning my competence. The cameras are gone. My house feels like my house again, instead of a surveillance set. Some people think I was too harsh, that I should have just talked to Lisa about her financial problems instead of involving lawyers. But elder abuse thrives in families where boundary violations are excused, because family is supposed to mean unconditional acceptance. Justice doesn't shout, it just waits. Some daughters take care of their aging fathers, others spy on them and plan to override their autonomy for financial gain. Both might claim to be acting out of love. Only one actually is. Some of us are older, but we're not blind. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's worst impulses, even when that someone is your own child. I didn't need supervision. I just needed to make sure my independence remained intact. Time didn't take my competence. It revealed who could be trusted with it. She once told me I needed help managing my life. Now she asks if I want her to pick up groceries when she's at the store.